begin looking at the second book of Samuel. Now, it was we English folks that split the book into two sections. The Hebrews, of course, had it as one book. Now, we picked up with King David in 1 Samuel 16. And we will continue to look, or not King David initially, but David, 1 Samuel 16. And we won't lose David until the second chapter of 1 Kings. So David will be the main subject of all of the second book of Samuel. This book will cover all the major events of David's rule. The first 10 chapters, things are going pretty well. It tells us about his victories. In chapter 11, things take a nosedive. And in chapter 12 through 24, it tells of the troubles and the evil effects that David's sin caused for him and his family. And it was not pretty. And we'll learn more about that when we get there. The first 4 chapters in 2 Samuel tells us, takes us from David as being king over Judah and his efforts to bring all of the 12 tribes under one king, because what happened to Saul last Wednesday night? He died last Wednesday night. Remember? Okay? Huh? Yes, Saul and all of his sons that were in the battle on Mount Gilboa up here died, sadly. And in 2 Samuel chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, we'll start looking at, by the way, the year is 1031 BC, roughly. 1031, roughly. This chapter is where David gets the report of what happened to Saul, and his song that he composes, his lament or dirge on the occasion of Saul's, the occasion of the report of Saul's death. David was in Ziklag, way down here. You remember he had been living in Gath with the Philistines up here, and he decided to move down to Ziklag, probably to be further away from the capital of the Philistine territory. And remember what happened when he went down there after leaving Gath when the Philistines wanted to go fight, and he was dismissed? He went back home, and what did he find? You remember? The place had been raided and burned, and everybody kidnapped.
Saul did not destroy.
Yes, yeah. The Amalekites specifically. And so David and his men chased the Amalekites down. 400 out of the 600 men chased the Amalekites down. You can read about all that again in chapter 30 of the first book. But in verse 2, a man has come all the way from Mount Gilboa, way up here, all the way down here, I think it's about 50 miles, to report to David about what had happened on Mount Gilboa when Saul and his sons lost their lives and Israel was routed in the battle. He says that he had escaped the battle and had seen Israel's great defeat there, and that he had seen personally Saul and Jonathan die. But in verse 5, David was very suspicious. He said, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" That tells me that David was very suspicious about how did you come by this information. Sir? Yes, we're going to see that in just a minute. Yes, he did. I don't think he had his crown, but we'll see. We'll see. He says, I had personally, by chance, look at verse 6, I had just been walking along and just accidentally came across Saul and Jonathan's and his son's body and found Saul wounded and leaning on his spear while the enemy was almost on him. And I found this in doing the study of this. It said, every army is followed by wanderers who are intent on making money. They will loot wherever they can from the dead soldiers of either side. They're not going to be that particular. And they carry on a pretty good illegal trade by following along in these battles and picking up what's left. It's simply a private looter, I guess you could call it that. Now, of course, normally the victors loot the defeated, but this man was an independent, self-employed man who did this on his own. And so the idea that he came upon Saul and his sons by chance is not probably true at all. David asked him, who are you? He says, I'm an Amalekite. Now, how was David feeling about that particular group of people at the time? Not too favorable to the Amalekites, because they had just raided his hometown and carried everybody off. In fact, it was an Amalekite that had taken the crown off Saul's head in 1 Samuel 15. Which he had forfeited by his disobedience in 1 Samuel 15. Yeah. By the way, the Amalekites were always enemies of Israel from the beginning to the end. They came from Esau, by the way. Okay. He told David that Saul asked me to kill him, so I did. And claimed he had found 2 items in Saul's crown. You're right. And his armband, or I think some translations have his bracelet. Now, what actually happened on Mount Gilboa, we found out in chapter 31. It was, and he was mortally wounded.
And he did ask his armor bearer.
He did, to kill him.
But that's as far as the truth.
That's right. Saul committed suicide according to the correct account. So this man has told David an untruth.
Well, in fact, refused to do it, didn't
Yes, and it's a good thing he did. We know how David feels about that sort of thing, and this man's going to find out real soon how David feels about this sort of thing. Well, in verse 11, we found out that David was just heartbroken by what had happened to Saul. When you think back on how many times he spared him, you know that he really thought a lot of Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. In verse 14, David asked the man, did you not fear killing God's anointed? Okay, David gave the verdict, which was execution, which was then and there carried out.
Not only that, they were supposed to Jonathan and anything larger unrest.
Oh, they were. He was. I'm sorry. Yes, he was. But he just didn't like the idea of this fellow going around and doing that for that reason. And number 2, claiming that he had no qualms whatsoever if he'd have handled killing Saul. And he thought David would be what? Pleased, grateful. Thank you so much. This guy's been giving you a fit for 7 years.
That shows you how little that Amalekite had done his history about what was going on and how many times. Because you know, besides David's people, Saul's people had Abner and all had. You know they had spread the fact that David had spared his life all those times.
Had he failed to do his homework?
I suspect
He had. He failed to do his homework. He should have known that taking that information to David would result in his death. So David, who wrote many of the Psalms, writes one here for Saul, on behalf of Saul and his son Jonathan. And in verse 18, the Bible tells us that he wanted this song taught to all of Judah. And why? As a memorial to the loss of God's anointed and his son, who was to be his successor also if Saul had not died. He wanted Judah, and eventually, of course, all Israel, to remember Saul, even though he wasn't perfect. He was still God's chosen, and he wanted him to be treated with honor and to be treated with respect. And he composes what in verse 18 is called the Song of the Bow. And of course, Saul was wounded by a Philistine archer. 1 Samuel 31 and verse 3. Or it could refer to the bow of Jonathan, who was very good with the bow. Excuse me, with the bow. Excuse me, I can't tell which one it was. But it says that this is recorded in the book of Jasher. And that is a extra biblical account of heroic deeds done by various Israel's heroes. Let's see, my margin has a collection of poetical writings of important events in Israel's history, which was gathered in the time of David or Solomon.
Were those found among the Dead Sea? Do we have a, we don't?
We do not.
That's one of the books that just do not.
It just does not, there's no copy known to be around.
It means upright.
Book of the upright, book of the righteous. Yes, I'm sorry, I should have told you that. But I think it's referred to in one other place in the book of Joshua, I think. There's another place that this same book is referred to. Let's see, verses 19 to 20, David writes a song concerning the tragedy of the Philistine war, how Saul and Jonathan had fallen. And in verse 20, he says, don't tell it in Gath. Don't let the Philistines know, the home country, know what happened and why not. Yeah, he didn't want a celebration on Saul's and Jonathan's death. Each,
Very hard again, but figuratively.
yes,
Don't anybody rejoice over this.
I don't want anybody rejoicing over what happened. Even though a lot of people thought that that's how, honestly, David would feel. I found that each side customarily had a group of people who rushed to report the victories so that the women in the hometown of the victors could celebrate. And he says, I don't want that to happen.
That's why I never ran a marathon. First man to ever run a marathon ran into the city of Athens, yelled Nike, which is victory, and dropped dead.
Drop dead. Well, okay, that's a good
I'm
reason.
not gonna run a race that the first winner drop dead.
Drop dead. That's true.
I'll use that reason.
Yeah.
Okay. In verse 21, David even writes in this song that I want the battlefield, Mount Gilboa, to be cursed. I don't want anything ever to grow there again. Didn't you tell me that that's the way it looked, what, 2-3 years ago when you were over there? Still barren. Still barren today. Of course, it was to be cursed. And it talks about a shield that was not oiled in the last part of 21. Now, what did they oil a shield for? Sir?
Cleaning after the battle.
Yes, and if it was a leather shield, the oil keep it soft so that it would stop penetrating spears or daggers or swords or whatever. But anyway, he says this shield is laying there without any oil because its owner is now dead. Sad, sad lament here, a funeral song. In verses 22 through 26, he says, even all of Saul's family is to be praised and mourned and honored. Verse 24, this is an interesting verse. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, and who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. What does that mean? What had Saul brought to Israel that it did not have before he became king?
Prosperity.
Prosperity and security, which made the prosperity possible. He said, you need to be thankful for this man because he brought some sense of security. And did Saul win a lot of battles? He sure did.
David
Was his,
was even greater, but he was still his general.
yes. Yes, it said Saul killed his thousands, even though David killed his 10,000s. So they needed to be grateful for the peace and security and the subsequent prosperity that brings, because it was all Saul's doing.
And he was the first king of Israel too.
He was the first king what?
Of Israel.
Oh yes, oh yes. And he says they were to be praised and mourned because of the mighty in verse 25, which of course was Jonathan, had also died on there. And it was a really nice song that David had composed there on that occasion, and asked that all of Judah remember this song and thus what Saul did and the tragedy of his death. Chapter 2. David is anointed as king of Judah in this chapter, and there is also anointed another king, a rival king over the other 11 tribes. Now, David decides that since Saul is gone, that it might be time for what? Israel has no king. It might be, yeah, it's getting time for the promise that God made me when I was a shepherd boy. So he asked God, I've been a fugitive for 7 years now. Was it time for me to finally leave Philistia and go back to Israel? Was now the time that God had in mind for me to be crowned king, or is it not yet time? And that's what David is asking. And there was only one way for David to know, was to ask God if this was the time that you've been waiting for. Now Saul would have probably done what? Probably just rushed into it.
At first he hid it. He
Yeah.
hid from it. So I don't know. Depending on which Saul you ask, I guess.
Yeah, the earlier or the later one, yeah. Anyway, in verse 6, David was instructed by God to leave Ziklag, way down here in the southern part of Judah, and to go to Hebron, which is further north, right here, up here. Here's Jerusalem, here's Hebron, Ziklag is down here. To go to heaven, which is about 20 miles south of Jerusalem, by the way, which he did. Then the men of Judah rallied in Hebron and chose to follow David in verse 4. And David's first thing he does when he gets to Hebron is to engage in a little bit of diplomacy. You remember the folks up here at Jabesh-Gilead, which is way up here somewhere? No, I don't see it.
Be on the right side of the river, Transjordan.
Up around the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, it's up here around the Sea of Galilee on the east side of the Jordan River, or the right side, please. You remember one of the first things that Saul did when he was king? He got a message, a dire message from these people asking Saul to do what? Come down here and rescue us because we're being attacked. And Saul did that. Saul did that. He rescued them. So in verses 5 through 7, he says, verse 7, now let your hands be strong, for Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over Israel, after complimenting them for what they had done, because you showed kindness in verse 5 to Saul your Lord. And then they took his body, had taken his body and buried it. Remember, they rescued it from the Philistines. So he says, I want to thank you for that. Now that city was located in the northern part of the territory and belonged to Israel. Or they fought on Saul's side of this whole thing. And David is undoubtedly grateful for what they had done with Saul's body, but it also enhances his standing with a prominent town in the north, which can't hurt. Good diplomacy on David's part.
If I overlook it, or we actually know how old David was at this time.
Well, let's see, he reigned over Hebron 7 years. He reigned over Israel 40 years. 40 years total, including the 7 years at Hebron. He died at about 70. So if we back up, that makes him about 30 somewhere. I think he died around 70. So he'll be about 30. Somebody needs to check my math too.
But realize how long he's been alive.
David?
Yeah, 30 years old, he's got a whole lot of military experience.
Yes, about 15 years.
I would say
About 15.
probably mid-teens when he basically.
Killed Goliath, yeah. Yeah. So he's not inexperienced. Okay, beginning with verse 8. We have another crowning and I think this is on here, or was. Well, I don't see it. I'm going to try to pronounce that this time. I mispronounced it last week. Mahanaim. Mahanaim. It means two camps. And if you look back in Jacob's history, you can remember that when he came to meet Esau, he set up two camps. This is the same place, same name. Many years ago. The capital was going to be Mahanaim up there in the north on the Jabbok. Wait a minute, I thought I saw the Jabbok River. No, I didn't. Here it is. Here it is. I finally found it. There's Ishbosheth's capital right there. In verse 10, it tells us that Ishbosheth ruled for 2 years. Now, we don't know how the rule of Ishbosheth's 2 years relate to Saul's 7 in Hebron, so we'll just have to skip by that. Judah, one tribe, followed David. The other 11 followed Saul's son Ishbosheth.
His name is in
It's not very positive, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Man of Shame.
Man of shame. Anyway, he is crowned over in Mahanaim, and it says that, well, of course, we go to verse 11, that David ruled in Hebron over Judah alone for 7 years and 6 months. Now, verses 12 through the end of the chapter, we have an attempt by Abner. Now, who's Abner?
Saul's general.
Saul's surviving general. Now, Abner is really the power player in the north from now on. He's the one that's pulling all the strings and getting things done. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, is more or less just a figurehead, if I can put it that way. Abner was the real power behind the throne.
I didn't think Saul and his sons, because Saul and his sons died, but his general does.
I don't know.
It's always been my question.
That's kind of a shameful thing, I would think, for him.
He should have been up there on Mount Gilboa with them, you would have thought.
You would have thought he would have been the first one to go beside, or right before them.
Yeah.
But David recognizes the strength of Abner too.
Yes, he did.
He reaches out to him, but.
Yes, he does. So Abner is trying to enlarge or solidify Ishbosheth's rule in the north, and comes into a little bit of a conflict with David in this chapter. Abner goes to Gibeon, which is just north of Jerusalem, which was whose capital city? Saul's capital city. He meets Joab at the pool there. Now, who is Joab? This is David's military. Yes, he's a relative.
He's a close relative.
Yes.
But he and two other brothers, Abishai and
Asahel.
Asahel.
No. So Joab is David's military commander, and Abner was Saul's military commander. And they decide that they're going to face off with each other at a pool in Gibeon. Now this I'm really not sure I understand. But each man calls for 12 of his best men to come forward and fight it out. And all the verse tells us is that each man of the 12 grabbed the other one and stabbed him in the side, and all 24 of them died.
Is that kind of like the concept of the line that?
You pick your best men and I'll pick my best men. We really don't know the motivation behind this little demonstration, bloodletting.
Almost like cockfighting or something,
Yeah,
just gladiator.
yeah. But 17 tells us that whatever that was, those 24 men that succeeded in killing each other, 12 from each side, led to something much greater in verse 17. It escalated into a full-scale battle, and Joab's men soundly defeated Abner's men. And then we have a foot race going on. Asahel, David's nephew, is determined to catch up with Abner as he and his men flee. Now, why would he do that?
You killed Kimball, you great.
Boy, you sure do. You sure do.
His nephew was Zeruiah was their mother,
Yes.
the sons of Zeruiah.
Yeah, and I think that she might have been David's sister.
Who she was.
Yes, David's sister. Yeah.
I remember that with him, but I'm thinking it was, because they were older than they were nephews.
Yes, all three of them were nephews of David, yeah. And one reason could have been not only to get the spoil, but also to eliminate the rival to David, or to the rival to Joab. We don't know. But Asahel was very fast, and he was determined that he was going to catch up with Abner and kill him when he did. Now, what did Abner try to do? He tried to stop him.
He said, go back.
Turn aside. Leave me alone. Asahel said no. The second time Abner said, turn aside. Kill someone else if you're after something. If you're here to loot, turn aside and kill someone else. Asahel said no. And finally Abner does what?
That's the spear. Back.
Puts a spear all the way through it.
The butt of the spear.
The butt of the spear.
Back. And goes
Now, I can only figure Asahel is coming at about 55 miles an hour, and he puts a spear up to try to deflect him, the butt end, and the rest is history. That's in verse 23, when he loses his life. But Asahel's brother, Joab and Abishai, continued chasing Abner until after sundown. They're going to get him if they can. In verse 25, we finally get to the end of the conflict here. The army of Abner, in verse 25, gets together and rallies and convenes on top of a hill. But Abner says this needs to be stopped. We need to stop killing each other because we're all members of the same family. Incidentally, verse 27 is very confused, so we're not going to go into that. It all depends upon your translation. But anyway, Abner, in verse 28, he orders his troops to stop fighting. He retreats back to the capital that he had just installed King Ishbosheth in. And Joab and his troops go back home down here to Hebron, where David is in his capital city. Any questions on this? Any questions, comments?
The high ground was important back then.
Oh, sure.
You had
Yeah, on
high
verse 25.
You were in the best defensive position you could be.
Right.
Then you gotta come up to you.
What was David's first act as king? One of his first things he did regarding high ground.
High ground.
He went and wanted Zion, the hill of Zion.
Well, it's 27, the conversation that he had when he down to the, is that?
Verse-
I don't have my, I've got.
Okay.
my hands.
My verse 27 says this. This is after speaking to Joab, who's still chasing him. Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter till the end? A very good appeal. How long, now this is mine, how long will you refrain from telling the people, how long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers? Now that makes sense to me. Why don't you tell your men to leave us alone? Scott, sorry to call you David.
What it looks to me like is Abner is the one that is the power. It's like a lot of places today, anywhere else. The military general is really the power, not the figurehead king. In David's situation was the opposite, because he was the military power.
Yes.
But in the other, this dude was just happened to be the heir to the throne. Okay, let's put him up so we have our kingdom. But the power was still the military, and the general was Abner. I think they chased him because if they could get him, it was over.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they chased and
The
chased.
threat to David.
And then they come to this point that suddenly, it says all of his army caught up with him there at that mountain, or whatever,
Verse
all
25.
of Benjamin, and got there. And so when he calls out and he says, you're not chasing me anymore, I got an army here, we're about to have a real battle.
Well, that's exactly what happened.
They weren't interested in fighting, they were interested in Abner. They weren't going to get Abner, so then they went back.
We've argued
Yeah, that makes sense.
earlier.
That makes sense.
And that's why I think it was just like, look, war's over. We got an army here. Do you really want to come after me?
Yeah. You're talking about verse 25,
And 26.
25 and 26. Yeah.
And so basically they're going, okay, so then they retreated and went home because all they were really after was Abner.
Right, because he was the threat.
He was the threat. If they could have grabbed him, that's why they ran as hard as they could, because if we could just run him down, game over.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they viewed Abner as a threat to David. They knew how good Abner was. He had proven his abilities for years with Saul.
He had obviously been with Saul when he was chasing David, because we know at one time,
Oh, yeah.
because David,
Abner was sleeping next to Saul, if I remember correctly, and he snuck in there and took his water jar and his spear. Yeah, thank you.
and he said to him, Abner, what were you doing? Why were you sleeping when I could?
He challenged his manhood. You let your king down.
And then, so there was, we know how powerful, because he did not speak to the armies, he spoke to Abner.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
But he's going to use that to unite the people too, so that's, David knows his value.
Yes, Abner turned out to be a good fellow. In the end, he turned out to be a good man.
Well, he killed Asahel, he killed him in battle, I mean, he gave him fair warning, and.
If you keep coming, I'm going to kill you.
And he didn't even stick him with a sharp end of the spear. Asahel was chasing him, and he jammed the other one, he hit him with the butt off it, which might have been a non-lethal blow normally, but it just so
Unless he
happened.
was running at you.
Yeah.
I tell you what, it's 3 till. Let's stop right here. It's a good break. Any more questions or comments? Because we're going to see in chapter 3, David continuing to get more powerful and Ishbosheth and his cause continuing to get less powerful. Any no comments? Let us pray. Heavenly Father, for the lessons we learn, every time we open your holy book, we are so thankful as it provides light to our path to guide us home. Father, bless us as we study your word. Give us insight and understanding and the heart to carry it out in our everyday lives. In Jesus' name, amen.